Our fellow teacher, Sharon Martin, is back with us today to talk about rebuilding self-esteem after narcissistic abuse. Sharon is a licensed psychotherapist specializing in codependency recovery with an online practice serving California residents. For the past 20 years, she's been helping perfectionists and people pleasers overcome self-doubt and shame, embrace their imperfections, and learn to set boundaries and reclaim their self-worth. Welcome back to AVAIYA, Sharon.
Oh, thank you. Love being here.
Yeah, always good to see you, and got another great conversation lined up today. So I know we're talking self-esteem and self-worth. So why don't we start there? Right? What is self-esteem? What's self-worth? What's the difference between these two terms?
Okay. I will probably use them interchangeably. They probably are technically somewhat different, but I think for our purposes, we can talk about them as very similar concepts. And basically what they mean is it's about how we think about ourselves and feel about ourselves. So, if we're familiar with the idea of, or the goal of having, quote unquote, good self-esteem, we can think about, okay, well, what does that in particular look like for somebody? That means that you feel good about yourself most of the time. I don't think anybody feels good about themselves all of the time. And so we don't need to think about that kind of extreme, but just sort of a general sense of, like, I'm a decent person. I have something to offer. I have some value. And, I really like this idea of having some balance in the way that we think about ourselves, even within this sort of goal of good self-esteem. It's to recognize that you have some strengths. There are some things that you're good at, some qualities about you that, people like, but we're not perfect either. So even when we have good self-esteem, we can recognize that, we have some weaknesses or we make some mistakes, and that's human and that's okay. It doesn't mean that we're terrible people, right? So people who would be struggling with their self-esteem would have a hard time with that if they either internally or, somebody else is pointing out a mistake or something that they've done wrong. If we don't have good self-esteem, that can be really destructive to us, and we end up feeling like I'm not a good person. I'm not a worthwhile person. It's like all my, value has been deflated because of something, maybe one thing or a couple of things that I've done, rather than having, sort of a foundation. We might think about that good self-esteem as that foundation of our, sense of worth as a person. And my hope is that, that we can get back to a place of recognizing that everybody has worth. That's just something intrinsic, that everybody has value, and it's not something that we need to prove, or we need, there's not a scorecard for us that we need to be checking off. If I have this many good qualities, then I'm a good person, or I'm a worthwhile person, right? It's just like we're all really different people, and so we're not going to have, the same things to offer. But again, that belief that everybody has some value. And our goal here today is hopefully that we can remember that, and we can sort of get back in touch with that idea and that feeling about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that you mentioned it's intrinsic, because that it eases my mind. I get all relaxed when I think of that, because it's like, oh, right. Remembering that we don't have to do something or accomplish something or, be a certain way or whatever to have that intrinsic, human value. Like, we're all born with that just by being human. Of course, we're valuable. So yes, absolutely important for people to remind themselves of that.
I think there's so much today of, that we're measuring ourselves against other people. And I don't want to say that social media is to blame completely, because I think, that's sort of a function of other stuff in our society. But, I think so many of us are just in this constant comparison mode. And generally that does, makes us feel worse about ourselves, because we sort of look at the best about somebody else, or only a very small piece of who they are, or what they're doing. And then, we look at ourselves and we're very aware of our own, flaws and imperfections. And so it's easy to, focus on, our deficits, especially in comparison to, sort of somebody else's highlights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I too agree that yes, like social media's influence, and yes, it's based on many other components of our society. But yeah, it's amazing to see also how it affects like young people. Like we have 2 teenage daughters, so it's always interesting to see the impacts of that kind of comparison lifestyle on all of their, mental health and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's huge these days. So let's wrap this into narcissistic abuse. So right, we have a
Mm.
little basic understanding of self-esteem, self-worth. How does narcissistic abuse affect our self-esteem?
Mm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways, and probably a basic, idea that we can just sort of think about is like that narcissists kind of tear other people down in an effort to elevate themselves, right? They want to feel good about themselves and they want the world to think highly of them. So part of what they do in order to try to make that their reality is they try to diminish other people in comparison to them. So I would say sometimes it's intentional, although I don't know honestly how conscious it is for all narcissists, but that's probably neither here nor there for this conversation, because the effects are the same whether somebody realizes they're doing it or not. But often people who have narcissistic tendencies, it's a tongue twister, they tend to be very critical of other people. They will shift the blame onto other people because they don't have much capacity themselves to acknowledge their mistakes. So they're always looking for the scapegoat, somebody else that I can blame. And so if you're the person who's in a relationship with a narcissist, you're often experiencing that as there's something wrong with me, right? I mean, you're constantly bombarded with somebody telling you all of the ways that you have failed, all the things that you have done wrong. And the reality is it's probably not even true that all the things that you've been blamed for or told that you've done wrong were probably not things that you maybe could have controlled or that you were really the person who was responsible for, because this is part of the dynamic is the narcissist is looking for somebody that they can blame for their own, shortcomings and mistakes. So, after this happens, time and time again, unfortunately, we start to internalize some of this and it starts to become, not just the reality that we're living in, but also our own belief system. It starts to impact the way that we think and feel about ourselves. It starts to feel true, or at least we question it. And we start to wonder, am I really a terrible person? Somebody's telling me I'm, a terrible person, or I'm, no good at this, or whatever, that context is. But, that's, again, it's a natural human occurrence, like that if you're getting all those messages from the outside that, we don't, we need to be able to filter them out. I mean, and that's where we want to end up. But we can't, sort of wall ourselves off completely, from outside messages, or especially if you're in a close relationship with somebody who has these narcissistic tendencies, you're not immune from, what they are telling you and the way that they are treating you. There's a lot of manipulation that's going on. And so again, that starts to color the way that we think about ourselves. And unfortunately, there's really nothing good that comes out of this in terms of the way it affects people's, self-esteem. You end up walking on eggshells around people. You're trying to keep them pleased. That's that other piece is, narcissists are often quite volatile too. And so, you may find yourself, or if you've, been in a situation that you were, really careful about what you said, the opinions that you expressed, or about any needs that, you might express, things that you might ask for. Because again, if that is met with, a harsh message of, that's wrong or that's selfish, that's going to start to shut you down. And you start to push all of that stuff down, and it becomes very much about, let me keep the other person happy, or at least, content, so that they're not blowing up at me and yelling and being critical of me. That's, you try, but it's sort of you really can't accomplish it, because that's part of, what goes on with the narcissist. If they don't really have the ability to manage their own emotions, no matter what you do, they're going to come out in an unpleasant way, at least at some of the time.
Yeah, like in that conversation you just had, is I think about gaslighting too, and how
Mhm.
detrimental that is. It's such an interesting experience for anyone, right, who probably watching right now has had that experience of then questioning, oh, wait a second, did I get that wrong? Am I thinking about that right? And then then you're really questioning, right, yourself, knowing yourself well enough to know what you just said versus what they said you just said. So yeah.
Absolutely, right? You end up doubting, I mean, not just your own perception of reality, but it's hard to trust yourself that you can make good decisions, that you're, seeing things clearly. It's sort of, everything about, you're experiencing and yourself starts to come into question, because these really fundamental things like, am I seeing things accurately, starts to be unclear, because the other person is so skilled at that manipulation, at skewing things in a different perspective. And yes, I think the psychology behind it is pretty fascinating. And of course, when you're in the experience, you don't know that you're being gaslit. I mean, it tends to be only afterwards, at some point when you're recovery, that you look back and you will start to notice a whole lot more of that was going on. But at the time, you're generally, you're susceptible to it because the relationship is important to you. And the other person is very convincing, in what they're saying. I mean, they have a lot of confidence in it. So it really makes us feel this doubt and this questioning of these very fundamental experiences. And that definitely spills over into other areas. So, you may find yourself, second guessing your decisions in other areas of your life too, that seem to be completely unconnected, because that's that piece of your self-esteem that is getting destroyed in that relationship.